We're live, ladies and gentlemen. Third episode of P&P Diesel, Philosophy on the Go. If we could have a quick introduction from Pearson to see what he's been up to over in New Zealand this past week.
Yeah, Pearson Schwartz here, checking in from Lyttelton, New Zealand. Beautiful little town on a port here, servicing the main city of Christchurch on the South Island. It is absolutely gorgeous here today. I'm looking out the window at about a comfortable 70 degrees, sun coming down, just a couple clouds in the sky. Absolutely gorgeous here.
Absolutely wonderful. What have you been up to work-wise this week?
Oh, we've been going ham in this garden. Absolutely ham. I've been
Just
pulling out
destroying it.
weeds by the bucketful.
Good to hear. I'm sure.
Yeah, we're redesigning this whole landscape.
Very nice. Mover of the earth.
Yeah.
Nuts.
So we've got a special guest here on the P&P Diesel podcast, Thomas Asama.
Yeah,
How's it going, Pearson?
my understanding is we have a religious expert.
Oh, I don't know about that. We'll give it a try, though.
He's wearing the cross and everything, so
Okay.
he's
A student of theology.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
so
We'll
kind of
try.
give your
We'll give it a shot.
what's your elevator pitch, Thomas,
My elevator pitch for
for who you are, what you're about.
So yeah, I'm a senior human phys student
Woo.
here at the University of Iowa. Yeah, it's pretty chilly out here. Kind of dumped some snow on us this past week. It's kind of all gone now, so doing pretty good. Semester's pretty solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is
I don't have clever as an elevator pitch as Pearson did, though. That
Yeah.
was pretty sweet.
Pearson's quick with the wind, dude. He's got the he's on the ball and that shit. What is Pearson, you'd like to hear what Thomas is doing next year, what he decided to do. He kind of took your path less traveled.
Kind of a brief overview of it, but I'd like to hear it straight from the man himself.
So yeah, I was looking at doing physical therapy school. I applied to a couple schools, but then I also applied to what's called Focus, which is the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. Basically what that is it's mission work on college campuses, and so there's a pretty large need in the modern world for work to be done with college students, especially as you try to understand what their life actually means. So that kind of just looks like a lot of one-on-one mentorship and working with young college students. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do. I have to pass my psych eval and my background check.
They're not gonna find you some serial killer or Jeffrey Dahmer type figure.
Then I should have an offer.
Hopefully no skeletons in the closet.
No, I hope not. We'll see.
Do you so I know we've talked about this before, but do you just for Pearson, how'd you kind of get into that, or because we have those focus missionaries in school.
Let me ask before, is the actual mentorship you're doing, is that religiously flavored specifically? You mentioned it's through a Catholic organization.
Yeah, it is technically, it's very much kind of Catholic centered. The idea there is that we're all made for some mission, we were created with some purpose. But then that purpose is also founded in the idea of a relationship with God that he desires to have with us. So it kind of takes the role of instructing people in understanding their value as sons and daughters of God. But then also this idea, it is directly religiously centered, but it isn't only that. So a big part is also recognizing the value in the individual. So if there is need where kind of religion is not necessarily at the moment what people need, it's certainly reasonable to extend it in that manner.
Right. No, I think that's going to play into today's conversation very interestingly. Certainly the aspect of convincing people that their life has a meaning or a larger plan, to follow in that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will definitely come up.
Cool.
Yeah. So kind of now that we're done with introductions here, so we had kind of discussed last week about we had given ourselves certain challenges. I gave Pearson a challenge that I can't quite remember. So do you want to go first on the response, or should I go?
Yeah, these were our ending questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I'm remembering correctly, the question you had posed to me to kind of work over the course of this week was, what was the line that would be drawn between Jesus comes back and evaluates things based on this factor determining whether you reach salvation or
Yep.
you are condemned, right?
And
And,
then-
that was the line you posed me to find.
Yes. So and then
And,
that
working-
kind of
Go ahead.
so that kind of relates back to the reason why I'd ask him that question is because of that Bible verse that I'd told you about, where it's like Jesus will come back and ask for the salvation or bring people to the salvation of life or the salvation of condemnation. I thought that was an interesting verse from John. So, what is your response there, Per?
Right. So, if we're playing around here with the canonical Catholic God, I would believe that you couldn't reduce it to a specific number, put a numerical value or a consequential value to the actions performed, right? If we were trying to draw the line between how much money you have to have given away in terms of a tithe or, how much physical consequential, good you did for the world. We're assuming that this is an omnipotent being. So I'm going to appeal to a side of understanding, subjective intention. And I'm going to draw the line on a basis of intentionalism, where if you had truly, and this is something that, the truthfulness of this claim can be evaluated by a being such as the Catholic God that's omnipotent.
Right.
The truthfulness of your character, intentionally acting, for the good of Christ's plan, of the larger good, the greater good in the world. If that was your true intention, there's no reason to believe that you wouldn't be saved. That's the line I would draw. Is it an intentional understanding of how you behaved with your time here on Earth?
Do you think that leaves like any wiggle room, and Thomas can interject here, for lack of perfect intention? So is it something where your whole life has to be lived with this intention towards, or at least we have this idea in the Catholic Church of like being like salvation, so like you accept, or it's a bit like Christian, more Christian than Catholic, but this idea of like accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior. Obviously, someone can't give a full and live a full and perfect life, but something we had talked about last week. Do you think that judgment leaves any room for lack of full effort?
Well, so we are actually given the benefit of the doubt, almost in a sense, in that we're not omnipotent, right? We don't have a bird's eye, God's eye view of all the consequences and factors that play into our decisions and how we would act on Earth. But as you become aware of how you act and how you can act, and its ethical and moral consequences towards those around you, as soon as you've become aware of those, I believe you have a duty to at least adhere to them as if, they were now governing your life. So if you lived your life without ever, somehow stumbling across any definition of altruism where you never were aware of the concept somehow that you could help others, you couldn't really be judged on that idea. You just kind of live the best you could as an individual person without that idea. But as soon as you become aware of that idea, I believe it's something that you'd have to take into account and adjust your actions towards that new idea.
So you think as like individuals,
there is a bit of wiggle room in that you're flawed and don't have a conception of all the goods that can be pursued. You know what I mean?
Right. All right. What does Thomas have to say?
So it's like, I think it's a really complicated issue. But what we're doing here is when we're deconstructing this idea of salvation, we're keeping it strictly to this idea of rules. So like you've posed this idea that if you find this idea of altruism, or basically in the Catholic Church we have this idea of natural law, right? Which is this like fundamental thing that pretty much everybody knows about. And it's like this idea that like murdering 50 people is wrong, right? It's like this idea that generally everybody has this foundationally imprinted on them. But the thing is, the idea of Catholic salvation sometimes goes beyond just the idea of following the rules, right? Because I could follow the rules for a number of reasons. I could do them because I'm afraid of being damned. We would call that imperfect contrition. I could do that, or I could do it out of love of God, which would be a completely other thing in itself. Where it comes to an interesting crossing point is when we're looking between simply following the rules, checking the boxes, if you will, like to achieve salvation, and then looking more at doing the good for the sake of the good. And I think that's the point where it becomes interesting. Yeah, it's a really complicated issue, I think, especially because there's a lot of debate within the Catholic Church itself about, like, how broad is free will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. How much you can be held accountable for your actions. I think, if I'm understanding you right, we are agreeing on the point of the intentionalism behind your actions. You don't want to just be going through the boxes to check them
Yes.
off. You want to be pursuing
Yes.
a good life.
I would absolutely agree, because how could you claim that a just God, so for example, I was born Catholic, right? So the percent chance that I will die a Catholic is much higher than, let's say, somebody in the Middle East who is born like Muslim, right? And they're going to stay there their whole life. It would be irrational to think that a God of perfect justice, like the Catholic God is, that he would damn someone because they didn't like come to know him in the term of Christ, because he placed them to be born in, let's say, Iran. You know what I'm saying? So I would agree with the subjective like concept of like judgment.
Right. So before we go any further down the specific Catholic or even Christian rabbit hole, I'd like to clarify some of my positions on religion. And Pete's probably heard some of these before. But I adhere to a lot of Christian principles, but in doing so, I've kind of cherry-picked some of the things that I see playing out in Christian faiths, but could also observe in other faiths, where I'm more interested in the larger picture from where all of these faiths might have been derived.
Sure.
So if there is an idea of a transcendental figure like Christ, like Buddha, like Muhammad, any of these significant religious figures, I have a suspicion that they probably all came from the same archetypal figure, same archetypal story, same illustration of that good, where it's translated differently into these faiths, which would explain the presence of having differing religious figures. We have Christ in the Middle East; they would have Muhammad, whatever. But the idea behind each of them is the same, in that it's just intended to represent the larger savior, the ideal, essentially. And that ideal can be extended beyond specific religious figures, because you don't even have to compartmentalize it into religion. Say you can even expand that past religion into just fields of taking anything as an idol. I'd broaden the definition of religion to follow anything you would take as an ideal. If you take science as your highest ideal, if you take I would even make a claim people worship money as an ideal. Anything that's the highest sitting on your hierarchy of values is what you worship in a religious sense, to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think I don't know how much the plan was to dive down this rabbit hole, so I won't jump too deep into it.
I mean, we can, definitely.
But I think
the plan is to go down every
rabbit hole.
So I think where we have to start to separate that out is, what do you think of I could in some sense agree that all modern or most modern religions are derived from a single truth. But I think what we have to go down is what do you believe? Do you believe that that's just some cosmological force? Or do you believe that the being is good? Do you believe that the being is chooses to be active in our lives? Because these questions beg different things. So does that make sense? Do those questions make sense? So
yeah, there's a lot of questions there. I'll focus on a couple of them, specifically the last one, where you mentioned if that being has any active will, any active agency in our lives. Mm-hmm. Where I believe, following somewhat of a Spinozistic philosophy, where God is
with that vocabulary, Pearson.
Oh, no, here, it's, God is this is his, substance dualism, where God is the substance of material and the substance of mind, where basically everything around you is part of God and part of God's plan, acting, with some of the other, continental rationalists, Leibniz, his idea of monads, would fit perfectly into this. Everything following this divine plan, and you're operating in this plan that you can't really escape. But the plan isn't decided by any willed being, where it was, determined by by the will of God, where you'd run into something akin to the Euthyphro dilemma, where if you were acting in the will of God, his will would be decided arbitrarily, in the things that he would decide from no basis, would have no actual reason to follow. So I prefer the view of Spinoza or Leibniz, where God is more, I wouldn't say condemned, but forced almost in a way to follow the rules of physics and the naturalistic laws. Where I would make an argument, and I'm really curious to hear what Thomas has to say about this, because I brought this up to Pete before. But my view is that God is kind of the abstract label we've put on the abstract ideas of the larger things that make the universe what it is. When you say, God is the creator of the universe, you kind of shrug and you say, I don't know. But you kind of, you go back and you say, okay, was there something that created the universe? You look around and there's a universe, and you can say, yes. You can't point at any specifically besides, the laws of physics, as science would try to do. But I think my understanding of religion would fall most closely in line with attributing the label of God to those physical characteristics, and why I'd follow Spinoza and Leibniz into the kind of physical equivocation of God to these forces, and these forces to God.
So, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting argument. The equivocation of God and reality, as in some sense, I'm very, generous towards that argument. In my estimation, though, I think so if you can imagine God as like what Pearson's saying, this abstract being, or some label we put on this idea of existence, right? We would all bow before existence in some sense. We are all bound by it. We cannot escape outside of reality. It's infinite. I think I'm very generous towards that idea. What I would say, though, is kind of what Thomas was arguing, is that then that nature of God that we describe then, and I think we can get from this sort of naturalistic God that Pearson's talking about, kind of leads into a situation in which we know we exist, and we are therefore these thinking beings, and these thinking beings then are, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this, but are creatures which, I'm trying to think what's the best way to phrase this, are creatures which in some sense do not, are like having a consciousness kind of implies that, or it raises, trying to think of the best way to phrase this. So if you have this naturalistic God that Pearson's talking about, and then you go forward and you talk, okay, so from this naturalistic God, we have these abstractions of what that naturalistic God might be. So you have Allah or God or Yahweh, and you say, okay, these abstractions are the best way in which we can interpret what this naturalistic God is. But I think those interpretations or those abstractions place before the observer or the conscious being like you and me, some very real truths that I don't think are evident necessarily by just observing, like observation of this naturalistic God, and when taken into consideration, I think are practically, I think, very useful. Like what me and Perry were talking about last week. If this whole idea of evolution is to become more practical, these ideas are not. They seem to be these revelations are not necessarily observations, but yet they seem to put us in like a better place for, I don't know what to say, but put us in a better place practically.
So I'm going to take a stab at this, but first so like the way you see God, like this is gonna be an oversimplified definition, but like in Star Wars they have the Force, right? And the Force
Sure.
kind of is there as just one like overarching thing that connects all things and like fuels the motion of all things. Is that kind of like this idea of your God?
Um, yeah, I actually haven't seen Star Wars,
Oh,
so I
okay.
can't
Never mind then.
attribute.
Tangent on that. Okay.
Uh,
So, but like you look at more of like this answer. So, like humans in our desire to come to know this force, like have like kind of anthropomorphized, like this like idea of motion, this idea of like law, like this extra physical law. Is that what you're saying here?
um, I would point the finger a lot at embodied cognition. That we're kind of trapped in. It's really hard to think about things abstractly. So it's much easier to anthropomorphize your ideas out this abstract thing. Where I wouldn't even call God him. It's just kind of this idea. This idea that we can point at it and say this is him. He sees. He has a will. All of these things are human characteristics which we are kind of externalizing to
Sure.
fit this abstract concept, because that's kind of how we understand it. But
Yeah.
what I'd like to clarify in using my naturalistic, terminology to describe God,
Sure.
I actually kind of snuck God into the naturalistic, actual definition of naturalism, because naturalism would, it is simply what is, and it strictly prohibits any. It's a very scientific approach akin to determinism and physicalism, but everything that is observable, and there's no divine fields, there's no metaphysical fields in that sense. There's simply what is. But I've simply put God in that playing field and called it all the same thing, where you
Sure.
don't actually have to separate them at all. You don't have to say God exists in this divine extra physical realm. God is the physical realm itself. So I just wanted to make that clarification, if that makes any more
Great.
sense.
So what you're gonna find actually interesting is what the Catholic Church actually teaches about God. So I don't know if you've heard Thomas Aquinas' like idea about God, but God is being, not God is a being, but God is being.
Right.
So are you familiar with that train of thought?
I am, yeah.
So yeah, and so I think we would agree with that. The idea of like physics and natural order, I think is just like the question of which came first, right? So I would argue that God created physics, and in doing so, he relinquished his control over such like phenomena as projectile motion or something like that, if that makes sense. Or God created like the law of thermodynamics, right? And like this concept that he is in the truth and the rationality of his creation, like in its, I'm struggling to word this as well.
Yeah, God is not like a nonsense God.
Yeah.
Like a perfect being would necessarily be perfect in a like it wouldn't make sense for a perfect being to not follow the laws of gravity or
And it's really interesting because the way Aquinas looks at it is, while he does say that God is personal, he struggles to call him like a being because he like argues that like asserting that would say that like kind of like put in an idea of competition between beings. So like yeah, what do you have like a reaction to anything we said?
No, I mean, I think Aquinas was kind of right. I'd agree that God is simply kind of being itself, existence as a whole. I think that fits pretty closely into my personal philosophy and thinking on the matter.
Sure.
I'm struggling to remember who's attributed with this, but there's a famous saying where you can't actually define what God is. It's much easier to define what God isn't in that sense, where it's almost like I swear his name was Moses of I don't think it was the biblical Moses.
No.
I don't know. Anyway, I'll try to remember the name. He basically said that anytime you try to put God's nature, God's being into a physical idol, into a physical being, in a physical anything, even a characterized, embodied he, she, it, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You're kind of taking away from the power of God, the idea of God as a non-physical, force, as a being in that regard. So I'd agree with Thomas Aquinas in that sense, where you're not trying to make him a being with you can almost interact and compete with. It's something much larger than that.
Yeah. Going back to Aquinas one more time. So what he kind of uses this idea of describing God. He mentions that the difference between homonyms and synonyms, right? So the word I'm blanking on homonyms here.
Homonym, like bass or bass.
Yeah, like bass and bass, you have the bass in baseball, and then you have the instrument, right? And he said there's words like that, which while they're the same words, they do not describe the same thing. And then he said there are words that are synonyms that describe the same thing, right? He used it a lot, the stove is hot, the pot is hot. Hot serves the same function, right? So in creating this distinction between words that serve the same purpose and then words that serve no purpose at all, he says that when we discuss God, we can't necessarily say that our words have zero purpose. I can't remember all his assertions on why that was the case, but he's we can't, on the equal side, say that they have no purpose. We have to be happy sitting in this middle ground of the adjectives, the descriptions we give to God are insufficient to, when we describe God in that manner, they take on another form which we are not familiar of, but at the same time, they're not completely useless, which I think is something that you were saying as well.
So, yeah, in an effort to kind of quantify what God may be, you're saying our words will always fall short, but that does not mean they have no purpose.
Exactly.
In attempting to figure out what God is to us. Do you guys think that God happens to exist in a manner where our because the Catholic or the Christian mentality is to kind of personalize God, and it seems like this naturalistic view of God, I'm probably not using that word correctly, but I'm going to keep using it like that. This naturalistic view of God tends to avoid that. So do you think this, and both of you, this naturalistic view of God can, as well as embodying all those traits that Pearson says, this idea of God is just being, or God is just existence itself, that God can as well be a personal God without necessarily involving Christian dogma?
Yeah, this would go back to my idea of taking anything as your ideal. I would argue that anything, and I think Thomas would probably agree, but anything you can take as your ideal can give you meaning in your life and turn you away from some of the bitter nihilism and existential dread that you can have, where you're just faced with so much emptiness. If you have anything you can attach yourself to give yourself bearing and meaning and to operate towards, that's going to be better than having nothing. And whatever you choose to call that, whatever religion that translates into, if you're following, the meanings provided to you by Muhammad or Christ, having any meaning derived from anything in that sense, where you're trying to take something as an ideal and working towards something greater, something larger than yourself, I would argue that's going to be better for you in just providing the raw meaning you need in your life to orient yourself.
So so that's kind of the idea of, what? Is it Pascal's wager or whatever? The idea that God exists, and if he doesn't exist, it's better to believe in him and have him not exist. That type of idea.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I find that very empty. I think it's kind of because really then religion and God becomes an object of denial, because then you're denying the nihilism, right? So I think that's completely empty, because then what you actually end up doing is you take the idea of an omnipotent being, an eternal being, and you put him in service of your own needs, which to me doesn't make sense. The finite creation just made the omnipotent his servant for convenience.
Yeah, if I remember the argument correctly, I think that when Pascal posed that wager, he actually argued that if this was your reason for believing in Christ, you were believing for actually the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
He believed the faith should be more personal to you. But I would argue that it's not so empty, and that it's so practical in how you live your everyday life, right? Where you're kind of wagering on in the same way that you are in Pascal's wager in everything you do in daily life, concerning all of your decisions in a very survivalistic sense, where if you were standing on the edge of a cliff and you had some inclination of the possibility that your reality was a simulation, that's a possibility to you. You still don't step off that cliff wagering that you are in a simulation and that when you fall to your death, you're just going to restart or something.
Yeah.
You don't act in that way because that is a wager you're taking, right? You wager to stay on the cliff in that you aren't certain of what is going to happen. And that's the same of what is happening in Pascal's wager. But that situation plays out in less drastic means than just a cliff in almost every decision you can make, simply from a utilitarian, basic mental model that you would follow.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the whole idea is this idea of God as kind of what Pearson's talking about, of this practical God over an idealized form of the Creator or Yahweh. And I think when we, at least me and Thomas, I don't know if I can speak for him, but when we view God, we're saying, okay, if God is being, right, then any adherence to his laws or his will is then not, or like what you're saying, is adherence to an ideal is not for it would kind of defeat the purpose if it was like for a practical meaning or like a practical purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It would only make sense in the context of attempting to apply yourself to an ideal for the purpose inherent in that ideal. So if you think of like, I'm trying to think of a very simple idea of like what God could be, but if you think of God as like this all-knowing, all-powerful being who wants you to wear blue, right, every single day, like a blue shirt every single day, I don't think God would necessarily, it would defeat the purpose if your if what you got out of that God, or that practical, or what you got out of that practical God was only the practicalness of wearing a blue shirt every day, because let's say in your town everybody likes the guy with the blue shirt on. So the reason you should wear the blue shirt, or the reason you should apply yourself to idea, has to not fall in that practical realm, and that is only because
when you say practical, would it be fair to say self-interested? It's self-interested to wear that shirt so everyone likes you, that blue shirt.
So when we're saying this blue shirt, it would defeat the purpose of following the ideal if you were saying, well, it's better that people follow this idea because at least they're finding practical meaning out of something, and we're saying no. That's not good. You're co-opting an ideal for practical natures when that ideal should be followed on the merit of the ideal itself. And so you're going against the ideal in some sense.
And intentionalist kind of positions, right?
Right. So, but you're going
the right intentions for each thing.
Right. You're going against the ideal itself if you say, well, I'm going to wear blue shirts because it's something to strive for, to wear a blue shirt every day, and I will benefit because of that. It's like an affront to the ideal of wearing a blue shirt.
Yeah.
Right. So I would go back into where we would have originally derived these ideals in the first place. And I'll give you a theory on that and how I think it would translate going into the future. But what I believe is that when people looked around these religious figures, I believe that Jesus was a really smart, ethical coercer. He was very good at persuading people to act ethically, and he kind of realized some of in my opinion, I believe he looked at human nature, realized some of the inherent characteristics that people follow, and tried to derive a way that was going to appeal to them, to coerce them to act ethically, to act morally, to act, unselfishly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I believe he was acting through God. He was the Son of God as much as anyone that is acting through what they perceive to be, good and love and selflessness and anything that, anything that would fall under the definition of God is good. If that's what he was taking as his ideal of God, he was simply acting in that way to convince people to act in a way that was beneficial to each other. So I would agree in that he looked at people and said, people act practically. This is the psychological egoist position where you are acting, in your own self-interest at all times. And he found a way to I don't want to say pervert that against specific self-interest, because that's too strong of a word to do so. But you can use your self-interest to achieve some kind of altruism, even if it is, your conscience nagging you to act altruistically. You're still achieving that goal, and this is the consequence and intention behind it. But by saying that he was from a divine maker and presenting these ideas as if they were spoken from a divine being, he can guarantee, with that promise of something metaphysical and divine, something larger, he can guarantee things like eternal life, eternal paradise, things like that for these people, so that they have some self-interested means, a reason to pursue these things, not in their self-interest, but ultimately in the best nature of their self-interest. If you act well enough, you can achieve eternal life and achieve eternal paradise for yourself, where you're coercing people with their own will to act in a way that is unselfish, where you're sneaking altruism into a selfish picture in an unselfish way, right? But you have to use something that's divine to give these promises, to say, if he just presented himself as a guy with a theory, he wouldn't nearly have as much weight as if he was appealing to this divine creator that he spoke from.
So, it's an interesting thought. I won't agree with it on the basis that the whole idea has to do with deception. It's the idea of deceiving people into being altruistic. In that sense, you're claiming that God is trying to trick people. So wait, first off, to get the basic line, do you believe that this idea of salvation was something that was like actually true, or just like a mirage?
Right. So I actually believe in eternality without any religious basis.
Sure.
So basically, what I understand to be the second coming of Christ is when you achieve paradise on earth. The heaven that God promised, or that Jesus promised, is a real thing that's going to be achieved on earth. In a naturalistic sense, it's not another galaxy, or it's not another plane of existence somewhere. Heaven will come to earth. That's the idea of it, is if you all work hard enough, and if you all follow these rules for each other, you can bring heaven to earth. The second coming of Christ is just establishing paradise and eternal selflessness between all beings on earth.
So then
that's the idea that was played out between them.
Sure. Do you believe in idea in hell then? An idea of like...
Yes, because that's the converse that we're constantly working from, that I want people to turn away from. Where I believe you're an eternal being simply on the principle that time seems to be eternal, and that matter, can actually be destroyed. It's just recycling forms. This is the circle of life, where you die as an animal. Another animal eats you. You become part of that animal's being until that animal dies and decomposes, and maybe you find yourself as a tree. This was, I believe, the basis of reincarnation beliefs. But the idea is that you're eternal in that sense, and you're just going to keep cycling through all of this stuff until you get it right, until you actually evolve to something better. And this is where I got into a really interesting conversation with Peter about epigenetic evolution and what we're actually working towards. Because the ideal of the survival of the fittest I would claim you're actually working towards is the ideal of this Christ-like being, where everything is optimized in that sense. That is the heaven on earth that you can achieve if you're working and everyone is achieving this fittest. You have to make strides towards that. You can keep kind of repeating a circular pattern, not advancing towards that fittest as an animal means. You're not actually working to evolve. You're just appealing to the processes of life and death.
Sure.
But you work towards something larger, and the eternal heaven is what is brought when that fitness is actually achieved, and that is the rule of the earth. And I don't want to confine it just to the earth. I wanted to confine it to the larger galaxy as a whole.
Sure.
I don't believe that your matter is going to stay on Earth. But the idea is that you're either working towards the heavenscape or the hellscape. These are the two ends of the spectrum that you can either draw existence as a whole towards, because you will exist as everything in some point in time in my mind. The idea is, would you rather exist as something closer to the hellscape or closer to the heavenscape,
Sure.
whether it's a human being, whether it's a tree, or whether it's a rock? What your actions as each of those things would be can bring it towards each one of those.
So a little bit of an issue with then the kind of the motivation there. You kind of spoke at the end, and then I'll circle back to something I disagreed with earlier. This idea of consistency of the self through different forms of nature. I don't necessarily think that that the motivation can travel outside of your like conscious life as we see it now, because I don't necessarily think like the self travels outside of your conscious existence or your 80 years. So how do you explain that from the standpoint of
the conscious not carrying over?
So
right. So how does that, if the conscious doesn't carry over, and therefore the self doesn't carry over, how does one provide any motivation towards this heavenscape or this hellscape?
You universalize yourself. This is my Kantian principles, where I love my Kantian ethics, right? Where if you externalize and universalize your actions towards everything, you can redefine the self as the entire universe, right? If you were to treat everything in the universe as if it were you can act in that way, right? The idea is that you will exist as in the form of everything that exists in the universe at some point in this eternal time, right? You will exist as everything, so you can treat yourself as everything and achieve a global, universal morality that would cover all of those bases. Whether it's because you've externalized the self from your embodied form to the universal form.
Okay, sure. So I'm just gonna make an assumption, and feel free to shoot it down. So if we assume that we have free will, then I find your argument really problematic. Because this idea that we cycle till we get it right, it completely rejects the idea of free will, because then it's inevitable that we will reach this idea, kind of like this idea of nirvana, this idea of like proper balance, proper karma, right? So I find that if we argue for free will, then we can't at the same time argue this idea of like perpetual reincarnation until like we reach that heaven plane, if that makes sense.
Right. So this is where I'd play into in Christianity, the idea is that there's a larger plan for you, right? That's the idea behind it.
Yes, but you can choose to participate in it, or you can choose to reject it.
Right. What I would say, I'm more of a compatibilist in the ideas of free will, right? So I would argue that you are indeed a puppet on the strings of the physicalist and naturalistic, deterministic kind of causes that govern the laws of the universe. But you are blessed with the inability to see all of those strings, where you have free will in that you don't know what's going to happen. Even if it is determined, you're acting as if you don't, because you don't.
So free will is an illusion.
That's only something reserved for the God's eye perspective, which you do not have. So there is a larger plan that you're cycling around it. You can't act outside the plan, in that you can't actually do anything wrong or make a mistake in the larger universal physical plan. You can't act outside of that, but you can stumble around in it and make choices towards the hellscape within that.
Okay. So then where does that come from? Where does that ability to stumble around come from? Because I would say that my consciousness is very different than a rabbit's consciousness, or a, because we have different matters of being, right? You have a rock, and then you have me. I would say that I'm conscious, and I would say that the rock is not. Again, more assumptions. But you know what I'm saying? Like, where did the difference in that come from then?
Well, see, this is more Spinozistic philosophy, but I'd press you with the question of actually defining what consciousness actually is and how it's playing out in these senses.
So, like, what is that what you're asking?
Yeah, what it means to be conscious.
So I would say that consciousness is the ability to not only encounter reality. I think the rational consciousness is an interesting idea, so we can internalize sensation and perception.
Would you include like memory and emotion in that kind of consciousness too?
Yeah, I would. But then we also have this idea of like rationality, where it's not just like what do you call it? Like an instinct. We don't. It's like you could argue for instinctual consciousness, but I would argue that like compared. But then you'd have to argue. Sorry, a lot of assumptions here, but then you could argue that humans in general have a universal instinctual consciousness, right? That everyone has like a basic what it is to be a human. We all share that. I find that problematic when there's so many different like iterations of how people choose to act. Right, you see rabbits in 500 different situations, and you give them like a very similar stimuli, you know, and they'll respond in a similar way. You give humans the same, like, you know, a similar stimulus, they're not all going to do the same thing. And then like just this idea to reason, to think.
Yeah, I don't know if I can agree with that.
Okay, that's fair.
Right.
So,
so what I'd actually say about that, I thought you were going in the direction where people actually would respond similarly to these kind of things, you know, appealing to a Jungian kind of, you know, collective unconscious, where we have these archetypes and characteristics in our head, the idea of a mother figure that we've attributed to Mother Nature, you know, the idea of what gives life, you know, we embody that to a female perspective, we embody the hero's perspective. We all have these ideas that are kind of built into our instinct in that sense. Where I kind of thought you were going in the sense of a rabbit. They respond similarly to these stimulus because they have almost a collectivized unconscious in the sense that they've developed a way of understanding the world that's universal, or at least shared across their species.
Yeah, but I would say that humans don't have that. And you could argue that that's an effect of nurture.
You don't think humans have that at all?
I wouldn't argue at all, but there's a mutability of it that I would say that rabbits don't have.
Right.
Why would I say that? A shooter pulls out a gun in a room. There's two very distinct reactions, right? There's going to be the people who run, and there's going to be the people who try to do something about it, right? You could argue that that's a mutation of it due to personal experience. But for some reason, I think that the human's ability to, if you want, mutate that is so much more complex than a rabbit's that we can't just call it a purely instinctual. We have to like lead to this idea of rationality.
Oh, I see what you're getting at. So you're actually appealing more towards how rationality extends toward decision making, and that you draw the distinction between. This is philosophy that I believe was written by this really interesting paper on Sarah Wolf, where you have first and second order desires, where animals can only operate in first order desires that come to them and they're instinctual and they play out, you know, without ever being able to evaluate them. And the second order that humans have as an extension of rationality, or I guess the definition of rationality to begin with, is an ability to evaluate the desirability of your desires in the first place and calculate how you want to act based on that secondary level of evaluation.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So then the idea is, where does the second concept, where does the second idea of rationality come from? Because like, I think it plays into this idea of consciousness, right? We were getting back to that question you asked me, what is consciousness?
And you said an ability to interact with the world, right?
Yeah, and I was trying to draw a distinction. Why I went on this tangent was I was trying to draw a distinction between specifically what is human consciousness, because you know what I'm saying? Because you could argue very simply that evolutionary consciousness evolved as the most apt way of dealing with stimuli. I don't think you could argue that about rationality, though. I don't.
So going back to your definition of consciousness in the first place, I probably would actually create the argument that rationality was, naturalistically selected by the evolutionary process as the best way to encounter stimuli. But what I believe to be true about consciousness is that it would exist in degrees. And this is an argument building up from the idea that consciousness is not somehow emergent. You can never build, if all matter in the universe is for the sake of this example, if you either have all matter being unconscious or all matter being conscious, and this goes down to the subatomic, at every level going down that you can build up from. You can either say everything is conscious or everything is unconscious, where you can say consciousness is self-evident. You invoke some kind of Descartesian cogito ergo sum kind of a very self-evident argument to say that it does exist. And you'd have to make the argument that at some point it didn't come to be from unconscious material. You could not build consciousness from unconscious material. So I'd argue that there is, not branching specifically into panpsychism, where everything specifically has a mind of its own, as we'd embody, externalize, human cognition. I wouldn't say a rock has a mind in the same way that a human does, but what it is like, I would appeal to a definition of consciousness where it is what it is like to be that thing. And that is where you can exist in these degrees,
like essence,
where what it is like to be a human encompasses all of these embodied kind of consciousness things, where we have, it's conscious to feel things, it's conscious to have memories, it's conscious to have taste, smell, see things. All of these things are what it is like to exist in the human degree of consciousness. But you can't have, in my mind, in my definition of consciousness, you can't have consciousness without. Or actually, let me say this in the right way. You can't exist and interact with the world without being conscious to some extent. So I would err on the side of everything, all matter in the universe being conscious to some extent, right? Because you have the very human understanding of consciousness that consists of memories and emotions. And then you consider that of what it is to be a tree, and you say a tree is not conscious in the same way. But we're both interacting with the world where we receive stimulus and do something with it. The tree isn't conscious, but when the leaves, absorb the sunlight, there is a process that determines what it does with that stimulus and how it interacts further on. And you can extend this to things that aren't so obviously alive. There's a rock that exists. And even with waves that wash over it, there is an interaction between the stimulus of the wave hitting the rock and the microscopic erosion that happens with the rocks being. Those beings are interacting fundamentally.
Interesting. If we could, I'd like to take it all the way back and kind of explain my understanding of these metaphysical ideas of like consciousness and free will. I would go all the way back to the beginning and say when one attempts to build some sort of metaphysical understanding of the world and the things around us, I would say the two base assumption that those must lie on is consciousness and free will. So before one can even begin to understand metaphysical truths of the world around them, one has to accept that you are a conscious being, and that consciousness is not necessarily what's the word? It doesn't. It's incommunicable. It doesn't commute to other beings. That consciousness is a unique substance or a unique idea, and then that one has the free will to act with that conscious. And so I would say, kind of to backtrack, that those are the two base assumptions that one can build from when developing a metaphysical understanding of the world. And then so how that goes about is, if you can imagine that consciousness is a circle, and you're looking through that circle, you must, in order to take in any understanding about the world around you, those ideas and that understanding must flow through that circle of consciousness. So one must accept that, first of all, one is conscious and one has a unique consciousness that one cannot apply to really any other creature except themselves. And then so, what were you saying? What were you saying? Hello.
Yeah, sorry,
You're breaking up.
you're describing that is. I haven't moved at all. Do you hear me?
No, you're still breaking up.
Can you hear us? You're good
Well,
now.
now you're
Are you
fine.
serious?
You're fine
I
now.
can hear you guys just fine.
All right,
good
you're
now.
fine now. All right, but so did you
really?
kind of hear
Okay.
my
That's weird. I was asking you. It's the lens you're operating through, right?
right? So if
Yeah, I heard all of it.
right, so what I'm saying is
Yeah.
would
you say I'm right in understanding it as a lens?
yeah. And then so my idea is
Right.
that this consciousness and free will, these two assumptions that seem so fundamental to any other understanding of the physical, metaphysical, and moral world around us, have certain implications based that those things then just exist, right? So there's the implication of morality on the consciousness. So because we have this free will as a base assumption, then a morality must accompany it. As well as these are facts, and as far as any other argument or observation cannot, by its very nature, if this is the lens we're viewing it through, dispute the lens. You see what I'm saying? So like anything, if you were to look at a thing with a pair of eyeglasses, you couldn't say like look at something, read an argument with a pair of eyeglasses, and say, and then that argument convinced you that those eyeglasses made you blind, right? So in that sense, I believe those two are just indisputable truths about our existence. And then from those flow
Self-evident.
What?
Self-evident.
Yeah, self-evident.
Yep.
And then so from those obviously flow morality, and then from those also flow this. And I think it's really interesting this idea of kind of going back to what you're saying, like globalizing that consciousness. And so I don't think it's necessarily a effort of trying to you make it seem as if it's an effort of trying to like squeeze yourself into this universal consciousness or this universal idea, when I believe it's much more about bringing. I still agree with this idea of like morality or especially societal morality is basically the growing of the in-group, or saying, okay, I'm taking my personal self-interest, expanding it from my own consciousness, realizing that in the context of that, I can use my observations and my intuitions about the world around me to say, okay, now that I think Thomas has the same sort of consciousness, so I'm going to grow, and because I'm bound by a morality that is linked to my free will, I can grow that consciousness to include Thomas, and then I can through the phone include Pearson, and then eventually try to encompass the entire realm of thinking things.
So yeah,
into that morality.
I should have so the reason why I brought up consciousness in the first place, and this idea, it was not a tangent. It was not meant to be a tangent, but I think I did a bad job kind of tying it in. The idea is, if we can recognize our own consciousness as kind of like what you were saying, that consciousness cannot come from things that have no consciousness, right? So then this idea of, and I'm still kind of struggling with your idea of the naturalistic God, but this idea of like the creation or things being brought into being, from a God who has consciousness. And then if a God has consciousness, and this concept of like, if the God has free will, kind of what I'm trying to do here is look at, so you said there's this overarching plan and we don't have the God's eye perspective. I'm not sure if you're using that literally or more of just like this idea of like this overarching plan. But is it possible that like if God does have a plan, then we can ask the question why he has that plan? But I was trying to like get to the point of like God having consciousness. That's why I brought it up. That's
Not true. That was the
we just went
successful
off
nature.
so fast, and I was like, "Oh, frick."
Well, Pear, I want to kind of get your take on what if you disagree, think it's how foolish you think it is of kind of my conception of like consciousness, because I think that's an idea I've been toying with for a while now, and I haven't got to ask your opinion on it.
So I'm understanding it as self-evident in that as soon as you operate within it, you acknowledge it.
Right.
And through that, you're necessitating the existence of morality and other things as real things through the realness of consciousness itself. Am I understanding you right?
Yes.
Right. So this is going to go back to my evolutionary argument, where I would say that morality and ethics and those kind of things are inventions of a consciousness that is higher up the ladder than specifically animal. But we certainly wouldn't deny that animals are conscious.
Right. So I would say full stop. That I'm not even. I'm saying that to even like view your argument with some like credibility, or to say that argument is that I have a consciousness and I have a free will, and I'm using those things to interpret your argument, and therefore those things are inherent to me. And because I have that free will is linked inexorably with morality.
Yeah, but would you say animals have free will or not?
No.
Or is free will you tie specifically to our second order ability to evaluate our actions?
Yes.
I think it's interesting.
That's what I
would say
Thomas to say. Yeah.
Right. So Thomas says no. I would say I have no idea. Right. I mean, you can't look into you can't see what it is. Right. What was that? Nagel's famous. You can't know what it is like to be a bat. Right.
Yeah, that paper. Yeah. Right.
And so I think it's really interesting. Question. I don't know if it can be conclusively answered. Right. Because you have this idea of maybe it is, right? I would take a much more ignorant view of like what attributing consciousness qualities to like other beings. Like you don't know.
So if we're arguing from an evolutionary standpoint, what's the value in an animal that doesn't have a second order rationale having free will?
What is the value?
Yeah, if the animal is purely instinctual, then what's the value of it actually having free will? I feel like it's not valuable. It's not necessary. Evolutionarily.
I was actually just clarifying my understanding of where you tie free will into our rationality and why you believe we have free will in the first place.
Okay.
Right. Because I actually wouldn't draw much of a separation between humans and animals, besides, on a specific will sense. I believe that animals are governed by the same plan that we are, and in the same level of understanding. They have as much free will as we do, in my understanding.
Okay. So can I make another interjection then?
Of course.
Yeah, go for it.
You're the special guest.
I don't know
you
about
get
this.
You get
special guest, Thomas.
He gets a free subscription to the Mug Club.
Oh, okay. So you talked about earlier. We're going back to Christ here and Muhammad and Buddha, and you talked about how you thought that Christ wasn't necessarily God, but he did have like some interaction with this idea of God, right? Like where he had some kind of like direct. Yeah, go ahead.
Jesus? Do you mean Jesus?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus was the son of God as much as he acted through the goodness that is taken to be the ideal of God.
Okay. So, but So would you say that was on any part like the will of God?
Oh yeah, of course it was the will of God.
Okay, sweet.
Everything that is a will is the will of God.
Sweet. So then why then would that happen in humans and not in rabbits? Why did God choose not to convey himself in a rabbit form to other rabbits? Why was it man to man?
So my idea of this evolution is much larger than animal and physical, even in a way, where we're evolving, and that this is my idea that we're going to keep repeating these patterns. We're going to keep cycling all these different forms until you get it right, until you actually advance somehow, right? But your evolution has allowed us to get to this point where, if you want to draw a spectrum, I'll paint a picture of it, where you have, really, okay, so I'll explain it even from an atomic form, right? If I would extend the characteristics of consciousness, or at least a will, to everything that is physical in the world, down to the atomic level, where atoms follow the will of something as they're following the will of these physical laws and things, and that will has produced them to form into the structures are able to produce cellular life, to produce multicellular life, and start the chain of evolution towards all of these things. But the question is, what you're actually evolving towards. So, right, I'd extend the question where you're asking, why would you not extend the understanding of Christ to something like a rabbit? I'd ask you to present that same idea to a singular atom. The idea of Christ is still playing out in all of these things. Now it's just become aware of us, in that we've reached this point on the spectrum where we're working up from the smallest points of matter possible. You have atoms, then you have how they arrange themselves into cells, multicellular life, work up towards through insects. You have a small fly, you have a cockroach, you have a mouse, you have a rabbit, you have a raccoon, all the way up to humans, whatever. And we're still pretty low on that spectrum. Towards the other end of that spectrum is pointing infinitely towards the divine, as what I'd argue that we're evolving towards. That's the ultimate fittest that the survival of the fittest is working towards, right? So when you ask why the Christ figure has only become apparent to this level of humans as we are, and not rabbits or anything before it, I'd argue that it's simply where it would appear in that unfolding as that spectrum continues to advance.
So we've kind of reached that threshold where that was an option, right?
Right, but it's almost we've reached a significant enough complexity where we are aware of that concept, right? Where we're still acting in the will of God as much as those atoms that formed into the cells that formed into every other organism are following the will of God. Now we've reached a point where we've evolved the idea of consciousness enough to be able to consider these things, going back to our first and second order evaluations of our desires and our instincts and everything, to where we can create the idea of God. And what I'd argue in that evolutionary argument is that the idea of God, and what I truly believe, this is a personal philosophy I follow, was invented as a tool for us to continue progressing that spectrum towards something greater. That's the ideal that we hold, that we would use to work towards that idea. That's the ladder we've built to continue climbing, is Christ, and our understanding of God in that sense. But it's all contained in the universal will of God himself as the facilitator of that process from start to finish, atomic to cellular to human, to our understanding where we're working towards divine.
So, and I think kind of, I like what you're saying, Pearson, from the standpoint of this can all be in context of, let's say, God's greater plan, or whatever you said there, kind of at the end of that statement. And I think a lot of this has to do with our understanding and not only definitions we're talking about, but like we can say the same thing. So let's say Pearson kind of attributes some of these attributes, and he says God one time, he says these naturalistic forces the other time, and I think it's kind of interesting how some people can agree with something depending on like what tune you sing along with the lyrics you're singing, or like what tune you whistle. And so a lot of this comes down to, let's say the operations are all the same, but let's say the color of the pen you write with is different. And I think even though there are some like base disagreements, I think a lot of this comes down to these conceptualizing, like and so the big disagreement obviously is the personal nature of God, but this idea of God existing as, like what you were saying, Aquinas said God existing as being, and if you sing it in a certain tune, I think you can be like, well, of course it's a Catholic, that's a Catholic dogma or something like that. And then if you sing it in a different tune, you can say, well, that's a Spinozistic assumption on the nature of the metaphysical nature of the universe. And I think it's really interesting. So what do you guys have to say versus how kind of closely, or what would be, if you guys had to quantify like the three major differences, now that you guys have talked for a little bit, between, let's say, this more Spinozistic and naturalist idea of what God is versus this dogmatic Catholic view of what God is. What do you guys think are the three main differences if you guys come up with a list? Or what are the sticking points? Because it seems like you guys are kind of not going around in circles, but you guys are arguing over semantics, and it's like, what are the main sticking points?
No, because it's very similar. We're very similar in a lot of what we're thinking, but like there are some very
right, and there seems to me that this idea of the of obviously, I don't know if I want to dive into the divinity of Christ question, but I think it's interesting from the standpoint that, like, I think metaphysically, like what Pearson was talking about earlier, where there's like a metaphysical promise, like Jesus Christ brings a metaphysical promise. And if you believe in that, there's that extra motivation that allows you to overcome some of those animalistic urges for self-interest and apply that self-interest into something that is altruistic. And so I think Thomas would argue, or a Catholic would argue, that divinity is real, and not only is it real, it is necessary for the decision to follow Christ to make sense at all. So would you guys agree that the metaphysical truth behind like these dogmatic things is like that major sticking point? And then what are like two more ones you can think of?
I would actually, the hardest thing that I'm struggling with is arguing this outside of the frame, like, of how I know God, like, or well, like the way I see God, because I find it extremely difficult to do because, like, okay, so just like speed course on Thomas's theology, just this idea.
We never really established that. This will be good.
It's fine, but like, it's just like, so if we just like go back to before creation, so it's this idea of God as being, but also as this like this being with will, like active will, this being with both active will and active plan. So God as goodness, God as truth, the nature of goodness as is like willing to reach outside of the self, and God as self-sufficiency, right? So God is completely in himself. He requires nothing outside of himself, but because he is good, he chooses to create. And so in that creation, he chooses to found beings in his own nature, through which he can draw, through which are capable of partaking in that metaphysical reality, through their own free will. So I think where I'm running into a problem here is like every time we come back to this idea of like man and this idea of consciousness and this idea of free will, I can't argue in the lens of like an active divine plan, because that's not kind of how we've set up the like this idea of God, right? So I think that idea of who God is, like, is his plan active or more of this like passive, kind of like just like almost like physics. That's where I really keep getting stuck.
Okay. Yeah. So you're saying this idea of an active God versus a passive God is kind of the
active God, passive God, God desiring good for the sake. I think it's God desiring good for the sake of the good of the creation.
Right. So
Yeah,
I think
so-
a pushback against that
let
point.
me draw some clarification to this.
Okay.
Go ahead, Pete.
No, I was just saying, kind of like a pushback that I could imagine Pearson coming
Sure.
back with, if I could speak for him, is that this idea of God, understanding that is a perfect being,
Sure.
for God to desire anything, or for God to actively will something,
Yeah.
seems like an impossibility.
Sure.
What do you have to say to that?
So, so yeah, your desire.
Well, could I actually put in something?
Sure. Go ahead.
So I'd say I don't even separate God from the creation. My idea of God takes him as more the divine facilitator for everything. So he's neither active nor passive. He just is the system which you operate on. It's the computer which the game is running on. It's the game is still running and it's active in that sense, but it's running on the divine program of God himself.
Yeah.
He's just facilitating all of this to happen, and it's not and the will that he has is just our wills and how it would play out, and the will of the tree and the will of the human to self-preserve. Those are all the will of God playing out in different ways. It's not like God, and in a way, God did command those things to act in that way, but he is those wills himself. He isn't a separate will from the creation itself.
Yeah. And so, I think when we say God wills, that's why I'm kind of struggling, because what I think God wills and you think God wills are completely different things. Which is valid. And that's kind of why we're having this conversation. But
yeah.
As a response to Pete's question, God desiring anything. It's a good point, because it kind of places this idea. It kind of undercuts the idea of divine perfection, right? But what if we say that the nature of God is goodness, right? It's just goodness, period.
Right.
Yeah, that's the ideal.
And so what do we see in goodness? Is goodness something that thrives when it is introspective? I think goodness is always directed towards something, right?
So I can kind of see what Thomas is saying from the standpoint that, if you can describe God as all good or
the
all,
absolute the highest good, highest form of good.
Good seems to be in a have externalities, if you know what I'm saying. It's not that good can exist.
It's not that
a self-contained good cannot exist. It must have externalities. So when we say God is all good, if you come up with a definition of God as this thing that is all-knowing, is omnipotent, is this computer that we run, or the software that we run on.
You're cutting out a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. Is this is it better?
No, just restart that thought. Yeah.
So if you think of God, if you can conceptualize God as this creation, or maybe not even a creator, but it is the software we run on, if we want to say that, or the hardware we run on. We're the software, we're running on this hardware, which is God. In some sense, that hardware, when we phrase it like that, it becomes a very passive understanding of God. And if you can conceptualize God as, well, if we were in complete alignment with God, we would be entirely optimized. And to do that, if God is that ideal with which we strive for, and so there's no perfect fucking metaphor for what we're trying to say. Sorry. There's no perfect metaphor for what God is. It's kind of frustrating. So when we say, I don't know, I'm just trying to
So let me put a definition to where you actually don't have to define anything. It's just the ceiling which you can't cross. The St. Anselm's definition of what God is he defines it as that which nothing greater can be thought. It's just the maximally great thing. And anytime that's the ceiling, and anytime you somehow manage to think above that ceiling, the ceiling just reverts to where you have just thought that to be, because by definition, if it's by which nothing greater can be thought, and anytime you think of something somehow quote unquote greater than what you had originally defined it as, it just redefines to encompass that new definition or that new thought.
Right.
So you don't actually have to come up with a metaphor. You don't have to define it. It's just the maximum.
So in that greatness, would you not agree that being or that thing or that system would need to act on other systems? It cannot be self-contained.
I struggle with that, Pete, because then you're saying that God had to create. That God had no choice but to create. You know what I'm saying? Because what the way you're putting it is like almost like that. The goodness of God necessitated that He create, and like we could argue like that the rationality.
Yeah, but necessity. I think you're framing it in the wrong way. So like, there's a difference between necessity, as it would be like we cannot breathe water. God is not. It's not a necessitate. It's God cannot be good unless He created.
God's goodness would not allow Him not to create.
Right. It's not like He's constricted.
Yeah, okay.
He's constricted by this idea of goodness, which is Himself. Mm-hmm. So, I guess the question is kind of a roundabout way of saying it. Does this idea of God need to... Can it be self-contained? So, does it require... I guess not self-contained. Does it require action?
If you're using self-contained,
right? Self-contained is the wrong word because of course, God is self-contained. Yeah. God is everything. But to say that God is not self-contained, but God must act, or it must be an acting being if it is a good being.
Yeah, I think we're running into problems with our differing definitions of God.
You're right.
Because with my God not having any actual being Himself other than the actual universe, and actions are undoubtedly being carried out in the universe, it's self-evident in my perspective that God is active in that sense. So there's no way He couldn't be.
Yeah.
A lot of this, I hate to just fall back on a linguistic kind of front of it, but in this sense, I think we are limited by how we can converse on the topic just by our language and what terms we have to do so.
No, I would agree. I think that's kind of like a good stopping point for the discussion on God, at least. Let's kind of fold into the challenge that you gave me. Although I think we had a lot of good points. I think were brought up. And Thomas, if you have any closing thoughts on kind of what we were talking about?
No, it's hard. Yeah, like you were saying, you were running into that issue of your definition of God, discussing those things. That's where I was kind of running into. It's just interesting. I would like to think more about the way you see God. I think it's an interesting premise, and it's very, very similar to the Catholic God, which is really interesting. But anyway,
so before we stop talking about God, come up with three.
We actually move on.
Three differences. I want three differences.
Before we move on,
right.
No. I just want to say I think we're coming from a similar place where I think we both take God as an ideal, as the greatest form, as that thing, and we can both operate from there. And I think how we understand the characteristic, interpretations of what that form is where we differ. But we're kind of arriving at the same conclusions, which you can do from a completely secular point or a religious point, where this was the argument that, where Pete and I, do you remember when we watched the Sam Harris argument with Jordan Peterson, where Sam Harris kept referring to his his moral landscape where he had at one end of the spectrum,
Right.
all imaginable suffering, and at the other end, all imaginable goodness. And I just wanted to say that he's taking the terms of heaven and hell and just
Right.
kind of redefining them, but they're
Yeah.
still arguing the same things. I think we're doing a lot of the same things here, but
Yeah.
it's coming from a very similar place of
I would
what
agree.
we would understand
Yeah.
to be.
I agree that they're very similar. I think the implications of the nuances, though, are rather severe, which is interesting.
Yeah, so what are like 3 nuances that kind of need to be resolved, and then we can go away and say, all right, then we'll think about what those are. Because I kind of need some clarification. So
I
like,
do too.
I would say the active versus passivity. I think that's a situation where we stuck on heavy.
I think God as a being not only contained in creation. I think that was the big one that I'm struggling with. Like, because yes, while I believe that creation, like all creation is in God, I would say that all God is not sorry, let me rephrase that. So where I'm struggling on is you're saying that God is the creation. In my sense of the word creation. And I don't necessarily see that as a case.
So we'll say God is creation, or God as a being outside of creation, or it contains, or creation as contained by God.
Yeah.
All right. So then the next one, I would say, I'll think of one. I'll say like activity versus passivity. And then,
But like, I think the problem is like this is like what I would call Pearson's passive God. Pearson would call his active God, because the way that I define my activity in God is different than. Is that right? Because you were claiming earlier that the God you see is very active.
I think the active versus passive distinction kind of creates a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Where I wouldn't feel comfortable actually defining it as either. But if I had to, I'd actually err away from that he was passive, in that there's obviously action in the universe. And as I take the entire universe to be God's being, I would say that God's will in that universe is active.
Yeah.
okay. And then the third point, Pearson, if you want to bring up one that you thought we kind of stuck on and didn't resolve.
It seemed like we had disagreements about the role of free will in all of that plan.
Okay. All right. It's 3 things to think about.
That was a sticky little wicket.
Yeah. Twas a wicket. We didn't even want to. That's a 4-hour conversation by itself. So
right,
now,
so let's move to ethics.
Yes.
Let me pose the question.
The much easier
Thomas,
versus metaphysical.
justify this, huh? Come up with any reasonable justification. Why do we deserve to live the life of comforts that we do, while the rest of humanity starves at our feet? Rationally justify it. Why should we have iPhones and hot showers, while as part of humanity, while another part of humanity, it is absolutely starving, impoverished, any number of horrors you want to point in the world.
Of course.
Why should we believe that our existence in the way that we do is not entirely selfish in the face of all of those people suffering?
Okay. I've got a response for you.
Yes.
'Twas worked out. I don't have the essay complete. I'm like halfway through it. And so I'll finish that tomorrow and I'll send it to you. But I was in the process.
Really?
Yeah.
You're writing on it.
Yeah. But to think about it, so I think it first starts with this idea of I think we need to reevaluate how to properly kind of diagnose questions. And so these are based on assumptions and questions. So I'll give 2 classes of statements. Assumptions are things we take to be true about the world or false about the world. And then questions are obviously questions or interrogative statements we have about said world. And so as it starts, I think this question And so like two examples of those are like we have kind of go through the list. We have definitional questions. So these are questions about like what is blue, and then we have definitional assumptions of blue is blank, right? And then we have based on those we have state questions. So we have questions about the state of reality in the world. These are particular in nature. And then we have state assumptions, which are assumptions based on those questions. And then we kind of move to like moral questions. So these are questions about the good, bad values of states of reality. And then we have moral assumptions. And then we have action questions, which are what should I do about X, Y, or Z? And what should, and then action assumptions are very embodied. So like an action assumption occurs when there's there's a shooter that walks into a school and I just tackle him, right? Because that strain of thought goes all the way back to definitional assumptions. I have definitional assumptions about the situation at hand, about the classes of things that exist. I have state assumptions about what's happening in that nature. I have moral assumptions about the good, bad understanding of what those state assumptions are, and then I have that action assumption, which is embodied in what I do. And so if we take this method of kind of evaluating questions, and then we look at Pearson Schwartz's question, and so I think there are, of course, loads of definitional assumptions that you place, and we won't argue with any of those. I think those are all pretty much correct. Then you have certain state assumptions that you take. So these state assumptions, I think the two major ones are that we do live in a materially plentiful world in the West. I would agree with that one completely. And then the next one is that there is people dying at our feet. I would also agree that one completely. They have literally nothing. Such a sad state of affairs. And I would completely agree with that. And then the moral assumption, I think, so my problem with the way you phrase this question is that you are asking for it's a state question with a moral assumption. So the state question exists because you're saying, how can you, or explain to me why this occurs this way, or why this state of reality exists as it exists. And I would say, well, okay, but you can't have a moral assumption in that question for the sole reason that that moral question or that moral assumption is just like we're not addressing that. Like it doesn't follow from any of the other state assumptions that are in the question. So that's the moral. I think that assumption is the one we need to address in this state question. So that moral assumption is that it is of top priority to address the material failings or the material lack of material well-being in the third world and other places. Although I agree with this statement from the standpoint that I think it is certainly good and noble to try and address these issues. I would argue from the standpoint of phrasing it in the way you phrased it. So I would say morality does not exist in the I think good bad exists in the sense that it is practical or impractical that these people are suffering, or is practical or impractical that these people are dying. It seems like a very cold way to phrase it, but I think it's very important to understand the difference between, let's say, like a good bad from the standpoint that this is a bad situation, from like the morality of a given state. So I don't think you can necessarily apply morality to this situation. You can only apply morality to the actions of given individuals in this statement. So if we're saying, okay, I'm obviously taking the assumption that our goal as individuals is to spread like moralness. Like we want everybody to act in a moral way. Like that would be this idea of Sam Harris's idea of of heaven is everyone acting in a morally perfect way, right? Following an ideal, whatever that ideal may be.
Everyone stands on a peak of the moral landscape.
Of course. Sam Harris could have said it better himself.
No, dude, listening to his podcast, he says the moral landscape. He name drops his book and everything like a million times.
So many times. So many times.
It's so funny.
No, I was listening to that one. I was listening to that one that you sent me this week today, dude, and he dropped his book like he was like, "Oh, I make some of the same observations in the moral landscape."
Yeah. All the time.
No, it's hilarious.
Ridiculous.
Oh, what a fucking goof.
No,
all right.
Keep going, though.
No, so in my understanding that it's making the material state of these people the top priority when I believe the moral state of these individuals or the moral state of every individual should be the top priority. So when you say, is it better to try and cause like, so let's give an example of a child in the third world, or just say a man in the third world. He's starving to death. He's got about 3 days left to live. That's about his food supply. Is it better then for this man to receive some sort of, and I don't know exactly the question, wasn't done right in my essay, but is it better for this man to receive a food? He goes on living and he lives an immoral life, or he is drowned in immorality after this point, or is it better for this man to live the 3 days in non-immoral nature, to not be immoral, and then to die in 3 days? And I think those are questions, although I don't have an answer to those, I think there's solid points that need to be addressed where you say, okay, what should be the priority? Should be the priority addressing this material state in the world, which we obviously, as you and I are intentionalists, if I don't mean to miscategorize you, but I believe you are, that we should be looking not at the physical state of the world as it pertains to morality, but we should be looking at the actions of all the thinking beings in the world. And so to say, yes, is it important to defend those less fortunate? And I would agree that we are not doing as much as we should be in no way, shape, or form. But if I had to disagree with one point in this question, I would say it seems like you bring about material well-being as the priority, when in fact I think it should be moral well-being or moral ability. And this only happens so we would improve someone's material well-being only in the attempt to make them more moral beings, right? Because that's our goal that we're trying to establish. And if we think of globalizing ourselves or our self-interests, we need to be able to spread this out to everyone, and therefore we should want for everyone to be moral people. So it is not a end that people should be materially wealthy or materially satisfied even, but it is only a means to the end of being a moral being. So
right. Let me go off on this.
Let you go off. All right, let's see what you have to say.
Yeah. I would first appeal to my favorite pyramid of self-actualization, where
what is it?
Morality sits. Huh?
I said, and who do we have to thank for that? Pearson's.
Oh, you can thank. So obviously, morality sits at the apex of that pyramid, right?
Right.
Where if you can agree to any evolutionary understanding of how life and our beings came to be, you'd understand that there are self-preservational and physiological needs that lie at the base of that pyramid, right? And this is where your food and your water and your shelter come into play, and you need to have those taken care of before you can make any advancements up that pyramid towards being self-actualized, right? So what I understand your argument to be doing is appealing that the morality at the top of that pyramid is not guaranteed, by just simply providing the food to that person.
Right.
However, I'd counter with that we should number one not think we should have the agency to decide who lives and dies based off the probability of their moral behavior in the future. But number two, I'd back that up by appealing to the future generations that person could enact or actualize in the first place, right? Where you're saying that it's more moral to let that person die in the first place because they're not going to live morally. That's a dangerous assumption or a dangerous decision to make in the first place. But as you move on, if you were to let them die off, you eliminate the possibility that they could bring in other beings into the world that could act morally and then reproduce and have other offspring that would act morally in an infinite series of events where the morality, the net total morality produced by that single person and their offspring going on would compound exponentially, going forward towards an infinite point where you couldn't actually say how much morality that person's potential actually contains with their ability to continue themselves, right? But that's all just after you've decided what that person is going to do in terms of their morality with what time they have on the earth, right? So what I'd say is you gave this person 3 days, and you assumed, if I'm understanding you right, that they're still in another country. Counter with is another counterexample to recontextualize the situation where that person is starving and dying of thirst and obviously acting immorally, right? Out of self-preservational animalistic needs, desires to continue itself at the base level of that pyramid of self-actualization. But I'm going to recontextualize it to say he is sitting. It's I'm going to make this example as salient as possible because this is a real situation that we get to turn a blind eye to due to our insulated nature, just due to the physical distance between ourselves. But say this is a child that hasn't actually done anything wrong, right? Hasn't actually, there's no greater picture of innocence than a child, right? It actually hasn't even achieved the potential to be moral or immoral yet. This is someone that has been born into the world and actually hasn't even eaten anything. And the risk that their death is going to come will end with them having died without ever actually eaten anything in the world or acted out any morality to begin with. They're born and died before any moral consequence can come, right? So this is someone you're encountering. This is a child you see, sitting outside of a liquor store, right? And I choose liquor specifically as a drug that is going to bring no good to anyone in the world besides your selfish enjoyment. It's the definition of trivial. It's the definition of wasteful, and it's the definition of selfish in that regard, right? You actively have to step over this child that is crying out for help on your way into the liquor store to buy liquor. And instead of having 3 days to live, this child has 3 minutes to live. And instead of buying the food that is also, it's a liquor grocery store, you could buy them food with the same money you're going to spend on beer. But instead, you walk in and buy the beer and drink it in front of them as that child dies at your feet, knowing you could have done something to help them, right? You gave them no potential to ever enact any morality or conversely immorality. You let them die to indulge yourself selfishly. Now, this, in my mind, is completely morally unjustifiable on material means, but also on a moral means, because you didn't give them the faith to be moral in the first place. You made the decision that their life wasn't going to end up in any morality and that it was going to be better to let them die and let all the future morality that they could have produced through their offspring die with them. You made that choice, which is a choice I don't think you have the right to make in the first place. But you also did it in favor of indulging yourself selfishly, where my definition of being selfish isn't specific to what you indulge yourself with, but is also how much you give. it's not just how much you take, it's how much you give, right? Where it was a selfish act to let that person die to indulge yourself. And that is the metaphorical example I give for everyone existing in modernized Western advanced societies, where we waste money on iPhones with 3 cameras and things while the rest of the world dies at our feet. That's incredibly selfish and disrespectful, where we are drinking that beer, watching that child die in front of us. You know, that is the example where we are continuing to progress so far into the green, if you're going to put this in terms of a graph, while other countries remain in the red. You know, it's immoral to continue compounding on the green that is your own personal comfort and your ability to exist comfortably in your environment, while other environments are still in such hostile and unbearable territories.
Right. So I would respond by saying the purpose of that kind of thought experiment was not to, in your thought experiment, obviously you would be forced, if you're not a psychopath, to agree with that, right? And of course you would buy the child food. Not only because there's a salient need right in front of you, but because if you just looked at the situation in and of itself, you would say, if that child wasn't there, you would say, oh, well, obviously you would do that. I think, not that anyone really does do that, but which is a sad thought, but to say, kind of go off what you were saying, I think I kind of used that thought experiment, what I was saying, to kind of make the point that, and it probably wasn't made very well, but that the end goal of any moral action is not or cannot be the material betterment of, right? It's not like you're playing a game of get everyone to some arbitrary material well-being line, and therein lies the perfect moral world. I would say morality is much more complex and nuanced than that, from the standpoint that that kind of breaks it down in a very like utilitarianist viewpoint, where you're saying, okay, I have set out and I've arbitrarily defined that if we reach X as everyone is at the material well-being of X, then the world is now a moral place. Where I would argue
I certainly hear you, but I'm just going to continue to appeal to this pyramid where you are arguing for advancement into moral complexity, right? But I'm saying that you're never going to achieve that moral complexity without bringing people to a point where they can act morally. People are always going to act as animals if you don't give them a choice otherwise. So I'm saying you have to bring people beyond their base physiological needs. This is the point X you keep referring to in my argument. I'm saying you have to bring them up past their base physiological needs so that they're not going to be killing and stealing from each other just in the efforts of their own survival, so that you can progress to something larger in a larger picture of morality from that point. So in my mind, in my argument, yes, there is a certain point that you have to reach before you build up from there. And that point isn't necessarily arbitrary in that below that point, everyone is existing in a very animalistic chaos.
Yeah, so I would put that point X, then, if we're going to say that is the meeting of biological need, as very much lower than I think we would often think. So, like, if you are living in poverty in a village in Africa, but you have one meal a day, you're still suffering, that person can still act morally, I would say. Or it is only in states of dire immediate threat to one's life that I think one is not able to act morally. You see what I'm saying? And so from that standpoint, I think, yes, it would make sense to take all your effort and put it towards the bringing those people out of those situations. But I think that X is a lot lower than you are leading us to believe. And then also, I think that X, people above that X, so people that are not in like immediate threat of their life, it is more important that they live moral lives than for them to have anything, right? So then they just become like one of us, right? They're people that are have more than they need to survive in the immediate future, therefore are transformed into these rational beings that have a sense of morality, and therefore it is responsible upon them to help those people up to point X. But then also, as living in point X, there are also other moral requirements of an individual other than bringing those people up to point X.
So I'm going to jump in here, and there's a couple different things. I won't derail the conversation in a different direction yet. But the first thing I want to talk about is, I think you could look at the levels of morality. So I won't necessarily agree with Pete that you have to be in immediate life peril. And I'll use the example of survival sex. So in Africa, we have this AIDS epidemic because mothers will prostitute themselves for their children, right? And so it's this idea of, like, I think morality still is playing a role in that. I don't know necessarily if that is a super moral action, but at the same time, is that morality the same or comparable with you walking by someone who's begging on the streets? You know what I'm saying? So I think there's tiers of morality that can be reached by increasing someone's, like, well-being, like physiological, like decreasing their worry for, let's say, like economic hardship. And I think that decreasing that enables the more altruistic sense, because what's the chance that that woman is going to give of her own wealth to someone else? It's very small. So I think it's important that our wealth be used in that sense to enable that. So I would agree with you at a point that it is important for us to help enable that morality. One point that I find difficult in your argument is it seems to me that you're placing this raising people to that moral like line as the end, the whole purpose for why we're trying to achieve this monetary equilibrium. And to me, I think that's kind of, I don't know, I think that's kind of empty if we're doing it just so we can like bring them up and be like, all right, whatever. Like, I don't know, maybe I think more on my standpoint when I look at this importance of bringing people above these risks of fatality, right? These risks of failing to meet their basic needs. I think it's more of off the value of the individual and rather just the idea that, okay, we're going to try to get you to the subsisting level where you can be moral, and then it's up to you.
Right. I think you guys might be mischaracterizing my argument a little bit. Okay. Where I certainly wouldn't advocate for a stopping point once you've reached that certain X point, that X line that we've raised you up to. Right, that is simply to get you out of the moral situations that the moral dilemmas you'd find yourself in when competing for survival. You know, sure. So I pose you the question: is it moral for you to steal the food for you to survive? As is the case in many of these impoverished countries. You know, they have to undergo some kind of crime. They have to do some kind of crime just to continue surviving.
And I think that plays into our idea of morality. I would say, objectively, is it moral? No. Are you culpable in the same sense for the degree of seriousness of that morality? No.
Right. Well, I'd extend that same principle to your example of mothers prostituting themselves, right? They're obviously doing it for their family, but in a strictly Christian sense, you know, the prostitution is a sin in and of itself, right? That is an immoral action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in the way that they do it, they're doing it intentionally for the good of their family, which is a noble goal, which is a moral goal. True. So it's achieving that, you know, it's almost the ends justifying the means.
That's very much the case. Yeah.
Where you need to raise the means so that the ends can be justified through moral purposes and not just immoral action.
Something I would kind of bring up too as well. I think we're kind of simplifying maybe the moral requirements that are kind of applied here. So like when we're saying someone had to steal food to get to survive the next day.
Well, could I just say one more thing before you start that?
Yeah.
the more someone has, the more you can morally require of them. If morality and
I would
ethics
agree.
is a luxury that comes with this kind of thing, the more that you give someone and the more resources they have, the more you can expect them to act rational. And I don't even just mean expect. I mean demand them to act rationally. It's the higher you are, the more moral capability you have. But the fact of it is, in today's climate, there is such a disparity between where we are and how much resource we have to act morally, and how much other people have the resource to act morally. And I'm saying we need to decrease that disparity so that it's more equalized, so that everyone has more of a capability to act morally as a whole, as a global, as a universal civilization, as humanity as a whole, if you ever want to achieve any higher morality, because it doesn't make sense to keep increasing morality in certain specific countries while every other country, just is still in this moral animal chaos.
So do you think
I'm saying
that
the more you give someone, the more you can expect of them.
Right. Do you think that
but it starts with getting people out of acting immorally just for their survival. And once you get them to that point, you can set a new goal and you can say, all right, now that everyone has their needs accounted for, we can say, we want you to start, actively giving back to the community. We want you to give, 10% of your resources in the sense of a tide towards altruistic causes. You can start asking people of these things the further you raise them up these scales.
Right. So kind of to branch onto that point, do you think that you bring up this point of the greater you have wealth-wise or materialistic-wise, that the greater the demand is put on you to act in a moral way? Obviously, as we can see from, let's say, billionaires or these wealthy countries that we have, if it is obvious that is not playing out, should that really be our assumption that someone who has access to all the pleasures and all the material well-being that could possibly have, that and greed is constantly being self-fulfilled, so they're greedy and then they get more stuff, and then so it's a self-fulfilling cycle. Do you think that honestly that then we can expect more morally from those people than someone who says, okay, has lived on a farm their entire life, has pittance, but is able to survive and can be given a more of a moral burden because they've never had those temptations? And before we kind of go into this argument, I think some clarification. This is purely like a devil's advocate kind of argument. I'm not necessarily saying that like, oh, feel bad for the billionaires, they have such a burden or something like that. I would never say that. No. But it's an interesting point.
I think you're taking. I specifically corrected myself as soon as I said expected. You can demand rationally of those people from a rational and ethical standpoint. You can point at them and say you're acting in a morally inappropriate manner with the resources you have.
Okay.
And I would point the finger at all of everyone in the West that has a roof over their head and hot water to use is considered rich in a global sense. So you can point the finger at everyone in that sense and demand from a rational standpoint that you can demand that they start participating in this altruism.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification. Then, would you say
it's not that it's naturally going to happen when you give people these resources because people are going to be selfish, but you can now demand that they stop acting selfishly from a rational point and have that be justified.
Okay, so kind of going back to that, does that make then? And obviously another devil's advocate argument, like the entire continent of Africa on average, then would you say they are less expected of? So you're very like to humdrum on this idea of like epigenetic evolution of a moral sense, and that comes with then a obviously you would need an increase of resources or moving beyond that point X for that to occur. Would you say then that the entire continent of Africa on average is less morally advanced than like a Western nation?
You actually were not going where I thought you were going with it.
Answer the question and tell me where you thought I was going.
Well, I thought you were going to ask if we can rationally demand less of those people. And I was going to say yes, because they have less resources and less ability to act morally. You know, the potential for their moral output is far less than in you know, I want to keep continuing just to say the West. But if we're going to compare just the continent of Africa and all the countries that are impoverished within Africa to the United States, yes, all of those countries have a less potential for moral output than we do, just on the basis of resources.
Okay, so I think this is a good point to insert where I was thinking another different aspect of this conversation. So I'm looking more directly at kind of the nitty gritty of what are we saying about this morality. So I think we have two different concepts that can be assessed here. We can have like national morality, and then we can also have individualistic morality. So I think in the question you asked, can a person in the United States live morally, looking at all that we have in context of like all the poverty elsewhere? So I think as a nation, the answer is no. As a society, for our society to exist in this manner, that's like this constant deviation and continuous progression that separates this gap between our two worlds, no, I think that is directly immoral. Now, in the same situation, on the individual level, I don't think the same thing can necessarily be drawn. I think moral action can be taken, but where I come to a hard point is, okay, an individual becomes convicted of this fact that them living in material wealth is in itself like immoral. So they choose to give up everything that they have. That would be considered a noble act, but I don't know if it would necessarily be one that it was what your situation demanded. Because if we look at our situation now, what we need like a societal shift, but an individual shift, like morally on an individual level, I don't think it can be judged. Do you know what I'm saying? Okay, maybe I'll clarify it one step further. Like me, I have a phone, right? And it's a cell phone. But in the constant situation, in the constant world that I live, I need a cell phone, I need my computer, or I won't be able to function within school. That's an assumption that I have to function within school. But for the world that I live in, these things aren't optional. Like, there are definitely things in my life that are optional, but for the world that I live in, these things aren't optional. So if I choose to live in a state that will equate me with, let's say, the poverty in Africa, it would be at severe damage to my own moral ability or my own ability to make moral action. Does that make sense?
Oh, certainly. And this is where it enters a balance of how this is a balance of how you'd weigh your time's value and your monetary value, right? Where you could potentially spend every waking moment volunteering at some base level cause. You know, you're just doing what you can at a soup kitchen every moment you have, right? Or you can weigh the benefit of what you could do if you went to school and actually started earning a salary. Say you went to school for something to where you could earn a significant salary, enough to where you could donate a significant portion of money towards these causes that would outweigh what you could simply do by spending all of your time strictly volunteering at a soup kitchen, right? So it's a balance where you can kind of evaluate what your moral goals are actually working towards and how they're going to help the larger picture as a whole. Because it doesn't make sense to keep everyone at an absolute baseline, and act and demand them to act as morally as they can from there. It makes more sense for people to become doctors so that they can, extend medical aid to all of these countries that are impoverished, right? And they couldn't have done that just if they were volunteering in these other countries. They needed to become a doctor before they could enact that moral use. And that moral use that they got out of being a doctor is greater than what the moral use would have been if they had just gone over to countries and volunteered by just digging wells or something.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a trade-off where you can weigh your values, but it all has to weigh on the fulcrum of morality, in that you're considering how this is going to tip the scales in favor of an altruistic cause versus a selfish cause, where you do need a cell phone to exist and get the education that you need to. I'm assuming that your goals are aligned with some greater moral good as a Christian, and that's something that you do need to establish and carry out that function that you're working towards. But when you get in line at the liquor store, I'd say that that's tipping the scales towards the selfishness and away from that altruism that you're actually weighing towards.
Yeah,
so
of course.
You always just have to weigh your choices on the selfless versus selfish, balance on the fulcrum of morality.
Right. And so kind of going back to my original argument is, after kind of explicating the understanding and the meaning behind that question that you had first asked at the beginning of this segment, I think the way you phrased the question would imply kind of a knee-jerk reaction towards a type of no-holds-bar altruism that did not kind of factor in any of these situations. In that, I think it is not it is an immediate cause, I think, for self-reflection on what, and me and Thomas were talking about this earlier, careerism. What is your career bended towards? Is it bended towards trying to help someone? Are you going to live for other people? Or are you gonna just live for yourself and all these obviously selfish goals,
right,
like money and stuff like that? But I don't. So I guess my disagreement with you in this whole argument is not that I disagree with the founding principles and all the nuance that goes along with that, but I think it is much more nuanced. And I think when you asked the question in the way you had phrased it, kind of justifies a knee-jerk altruism that doesn't really take into account all of these factors, even though kind of it goes back to the tune you're whistling versus the lyrics you're singing. It's you may be singing the lyrics that lead us to this point of, okay, it's this nuanced altruism that says, how can I maximize my benefit towards others, understanding that there's all these factors in play, not least of which is personal factors, so like what Thomas was saying with the cell phone, to help you become a doctor, but that it is an allowance, has an allowance there for some sort of, I wouldn't say failure, but it is not I would say, and I think they were talking about this on the Sam Harris podcast, it is not say, every time you fail,
that, right?
Right. It's not like a failure of every time you do anything, every time you have a beer with your mates, it's not a failure. Oh, it's this monumental failure. You could have been saving lives in Africa. It's like, no, you got to wake up every day and have this opportunity to save lives in Africa. It's not, it shouldn't be, or Africa or China, I don't know. Picking on Africa, but or it should be, I don't know. It's the tune that I necessarily have an issue with, from the standpoint that it implies a lot of negativity in the situation we live in when you, and we were kind of talking about this earlier, is there's the ways to be optimistic is we should not be negative because, we live in this world of great material well-being, and this has been given to us through no fault of our own. We didn't cause this in any way. We're just sons and daughters of a Western society where we're given all this good stuff, and we just wallow in it. We don't do anything with it. And look at all this stuff we make, these cameras with the 3 iPhones, and all those are good points. But you can also wake up with a mindset of, I'm going to wake up today and damn, if I don't have the opportunity to do 3 things that may save a life in Africa, if I don't have the opportunity to give 10, 20, 30%, hopefully then 50%, and all the money that you need that you could possibly give towards donations rather than kind of wallowing in this I don't know, like what we were talking about before, like resentment. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily healthy to grow that resentment, and so it matters how you phrase the
Right.
questions.
No, I definitely phrased it intentionally.
Right, and obviously,
as
yeah,
something
obviously,
that was going to cause distress and hopefully just cause you to evaluate your decisions.
of course, and I think
on more of a significant scale. I really
Yeah.
want to add significance and meaning to the situation.
right,
Right. But yeah, I went back. I think that podcast does actually a really great job. That guy's name is William McCaskill.
yep,
He is an Oxford philosopher, and I went back and I read that Peter Singer paper that they kept talking about. It's called Wealth, Affluence, Famine, Wealth, Affluence, and Famine, maybe something else. But it was just under the title of effective altruism, and I think they did a really good job exploring what effective altruism actually means, considering things like the psychological weight that comes along with those kinds of things.
right,
Right, because like you said, I really liked your beer example. You know, you have a beer with the homies, right? That was money that you could have used to, help someone directly, right? But you have to maintain some kind of psychological equilibrium within yourself to continue being productive and continue producing a high moral output. To continue being high performing in that regard and maximizing your moral output, you have to ensure some kind of psychological stability within yourself, whether that means having fun with your friends every once in a while as a way to maintain that high level so you can continue outputting at a high level. That's certainly a reasonable argument. I really enjoyed how he broke that down, specifically in how he views his salary too. He makes a significant amount, but I think the number he came up with was 2,000. He's from Oxford, right? So this is in pounds, but his number was like 2,600 pounds, translating to something equivalent to $3,000 or $3,500 or something. 35K. I think that was his annual budget, and the rest could be donated. But I think he did a really good job of actually defining where the limits are,
and then
for being the most effective altruistic actor you can be.
yeah, and before I forget these phrases, I think another thing that he did really well was kind of highlighted the difference between like being a probabilist and being an actualist. So like the example he gave was, again, going out to the bars, it's okay, I have a situation in which I could go home, watch TV, I could go home and study, or or go out with my friends. Obviously, it would be the most moral to go home and study. The next would be going out with your friends. And then the third would be not maybe getting into rampant drinking with your friends, but going out and having a good time with your friends. And then the last would be going home and watching TV. Like that probabilist would say, well, you have probabilist would say, well, you have this opportunity to pursue this greater goal of going home and study, so you should go home to study. When an actualist would say, well, you're going to go home, study for 20 minutes, and then watch TV the rest of the night. So you should just go do this. So it's like, or go out with your friends. So I think we can kind of embed that in our situation where, like, okay, you can say you're going to go give $50,000 or 50% of your salary away, but you have the probability to do that, and you could do that, but if you had to give away 50% of your salary away every month, you would become kind of resentful towards that, and you wouldn't be able to do it. So maybe start with 5%, right? And then move up to 10, and then move up to 20.
So I think this is an obvious line, but I think it's important to draw. I think the excess line also needs to be drawn as well. So like, iPhone, and I think our culture perpetuates this idea. But yeah, like iPhone with 3 cameras, like obviously excess. So like it's making that moral decision in an applicable way. Going back to this idea of like this probabilist versus the actualist, right? It's like the excess of that enjoyment, this excess of like choosing to like jump into that. Yes, we need to maintain a healthy equilibrium, but where does that lie?
No, that's spot on, and I just advocate for a more conservative reconsideration of the personal comforts you actually need to continue, the maximal moral output you can. This has always been my problem and why I don't call myself specifically a utilitarianist, where the utilitarian, in the pursuit of the greater good, you can really use the greater good to justify any level of self-comfort you would like. You can really say, to be truly the best person possible, I really do need this super yacht, right? And you can go up as far as you want, justifying what you'd like for yourself. But I just advocate for a more conservative estimate of what you actually need in terms of weighing what is excessive and what is absolutely necessitated for your maximal moral output.
Yeah.
So I'd appeal to a conservative utilitarianism in that aspect.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that.
No, that was actually my favorite podcast that I've listened to in a while, though. That was kind of a random one I just put on. I just kind of scrolled through and picked one pretty
When did you
random.
listen to that? Because that one was kind of spot on with what. I mean, his ideas were very resonant of what we've talked about in the past.
No, yeah. What day did I send it to you? Was that like?
It was like the day after.
Monday?
It was like, Monday, I think. Monday or Sunday.
Yeah, I just listened to it that day. No, yeah, he did a great job illustrating the salience that the Peter Singer did. I'd recommend you actually read that paper that they kept talking about.
Okay. What is that called?
The salient example they were using, I appealed to the child is starving at your feet. The example that Peter Singer kept using was the child is drowning in a shallow pond
right.
or whatever. That was the thing. But I think he did a great job illustrating the pressing nature of it and actually contextualizing it in something, in an example that you can visualize in any effective way.
No, 100%.
Yeah, I'd recommend Thomas listen to that one too. I think that was a.
It's that's not that's the essay, but if you got it's called Making Sense. I can just text it to you. I'll just email it to you. Send you the link.
No, it's definitely worth it. I actually really liked that guy, William McCaskill.
William McCaskill. He seemed really interested, and he's like the youngest tenured philosophy professor ever, or something like that, at Oxford. Which was really because he's like 29.
Oh yeah, he made a really great point. It was really succinct about maximizing the moral output, where he said, you can justify the existence of higher what would it be like higher developed things in a society, where he'd kind of say, if we're trying to play as morally as possible, would Oxford still exist? And it was yes, but the lawns wouldn't be as well kept. And it was a great way to visualize, where you can draw the lines of what is excessive and what is necessary in terms of trying to maximize the output. Oxford and the ideas that it would produce as a academic institution of high rigor would still be beneficial, but the lawns, wouldn't be as excessively maintained.
Right.
Because it'd be neglect to surrender academic excellence. That would be a moral neglect, I think.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Yeah.
Because you have to find that balance. But in my mind, my arguments against so much of the West, and specifically in capitalism, is that it's actively trying to get you to indulge in excess because there is a profit motive behind that. And I have just enormous problems with all of that as a system as a whole. I think it's incredibly dangerous. Part of why I believe there's so much moral corruption and disparity in the world.
Yeah.
No, I would 100% agree.
I don't know the solution. That's the problem.
Right. And I think it's just very important to point it out. I think that's what he did in this podcast to a really great extent.
Yeah, I would 100% listen to that.
Yeah.
Do we want to set ourselves a challenge for this next Friday? So if you have any ideas, I think I'm trying to think. Does Thomas have a question that he wants answered?
Oh, I don't know.
I got one for both of you.
Okay.
This is something I'm workshopping into a larger ethical and moral theory that I'm trying to convince people of. Considering some of the evolutionary ideas I have, where is there a rational way to convince people that they are eternal without appealing to something divine as religion?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Well, because I think there's enormous value in convincing people that they are eternal, because it gives their action meaning beyond this singular life that they're leading, where you can't just kind of live it up in a hedonistic, free for all in your 80 years here and then just check out. I think there's enormous value in convincing people, no, there's no way of getting out of this. You have to make this the best that you possibly can. I think if I can convince people that they're eternal in that sense, and that you can't check out of this, and that this is as good as it gets, and as good as you can make it is as good as it gets, it's going to be enormously beneficial to that idea. So that's something I've been working towards.
No, it's I like that.
But I'd love other input on trying to convince people that they're eternal and that their actions have meaning beyond this singular life that they're leading. So that's my challenge for both of you.
Okay. Challenge accepted. I have to figure out how to formulate my question. I may have to hit you back after sometime later tonight or this morning. I've got an idea, but it has to do with my ideas on consciousness and free will as base assumptions. But
all right.
I know there's some I'm struggling with there.
I understand your argument on that, but I would like to.
Yes, so I'm gonna definitely have to ask a question, but I'll get back to you on that.
Right, Thomas, you have anything in the moment for me?
I don't. I'm trying to think. It's interesting because I don't normally think in this I normally leave a lot of this philosophy and then I just go think theology but it's in my realm of God, so it's different. So but no, it's good. I like this. I have to give it some thought.
Yeah, all right. No, just just tax it out or something.
Yeah, sweet.
I'd certainly like some to work over for the week.
I'll let Pete know.
Pete, you did record all this, yeah?
Yes, it has been recorded. All right, where do we need to put this as the first recorded P&P Diesel podcast?
Yeah, the PP Diesel. Visit ppdiesel.gov for subscriber-only content and exclusive first access to tickets for our live events.
And we just want to say a shout out to all Patreon supporters. We know that it is not within
valuable.
the. We'll write you off. We'll give you a ticket for your effective altruism for the day if you subscribe to us on Patreon.
The making of P&P Diesel coming up.
Yeah,
with some tours of Pete's room and the wonky stuff he has hanging on his walls.
If you found this podcast valuable, consider supporting it on Patreon.
No, but we need to put. I'm tempted to just throw the audio up on YouTube, dude. Make a P&P channel.
P&P Diesel.
See what happens.
I still have that picture.
Yeah, I do, dude. And then we'll have to.
That's my truck.
See if we can just try to what are some? We need to come up with some hashtags that would be allow our get the most
to expand our reach.
Yeah, I'm thinking anything Jordan Peterson, anything Sam Harris, some JRE experience, Joe Rogan experience hashtags in there.
Landscape.
I think I've reviewed some of those ideas in the moral landscape myself.
Yeah, dude.
All right.
Hashtag maps of meaning.
Hashtag maps of meaning. Hashtag 12 rules. All right. I think that's it from the for the third episode.
That's it. Great podcast, boys.
Great podcast.
Great
Absolutely perfect.
Good talking to you.
Hopefully, maybe Thomas will think about coming back, but sometime maybe we'll have he'll be a returning guest. But I'm excited, dude, to answer this question.
Yeah,
this is a very metaphysical question. Moving away from morals in the fourth episode.
Right.
All right. Well, signing off.
Sounds good,
Episode
Grayson.
4 coming soon.
Coming
DMT
soon.
Diesel signing off. Thank you all.